Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to How the Dark Web Works, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Tamara Roos, and I am your moderator for today. Our presenter for the webinar today is Matt Duran. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a Black Hat USA instructor. He holds his computer science degree from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Matt is a co-author of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. Matt, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Tamara, and thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon or good morning, whichever applies more accurately to you. We are going to be taking a spin through some of the darker corners of the internet today and talking about the dark web, a topic that honestly is kind of near and dear to my heart. A lot of the research that I end up doing on the back end here for LMG Security involves the dark web in one way or another, whether that be following ransomware operators, looking for illicit sales of stolen goods. Really a lot of different elements of cybercrime exist because of the dark web, and so I'm happy I get to walk you through it and kind of demystify some of the elements of the dark web which people don't really seem to know that much about. And I mean, that's fair, they really shouldn't. This is not a place where we recommend normal people go for the most part. But yeah, again, we'll try to make this a little bit more understandable for everyone. So today's roadmap is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to go through what the dark web actually is. We're going to talk about the underlying technology that actually makes it work. Specifically, we'll talk about onion routing and the Tor network. We're going to talk about how you access the dark web, and if you choose to, how you can do so safely. We'll talk about hacker portals and stolen data, the goods that we find for sale on the dark web. We'll cover dark web marketplaces, which are amazingly similar to modern e-commerce websites, things like Amazon or eBay or some of the other e-commerce sites you're likely used to seeing. We'll go over law enforcement takedowns and activity that has started to kind of stem the flow of criminal activity on the dark web. And then as we go through, we'll point out some tips and tricks on how to keep yourself safe and keep yourself from, winding up on the dark web in the first place. As Tamara mentioned, my name is Matt Duran. I'm the Director of Training and Research. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about what we do here at LMG Security, highly recommend you check out our new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, Response and Prevention, authored by myself, our CEO, Sherry Davidoff, and our COO, Karen Springer. I promise you, it is not just a full technical guide on how to deal with ransomware. There's a lot of anecdotal stories and a lot of general information about cybercrime as pertained through the entire history of, cyber criminal enterprises. Highly recommend you check it out. Okay, that's enough shameless self-promotion for me. Thank you for allowing me to do that. The reason we wanted to talk about this today is because we've seen a notable increase in the usage of the dark web over the last few years. It's estimated that we've had a rise of about 2 million users, 200,000 users, up to 2.7 million users every day that utilize the dark web for some purpose or another. And more than half the time, that purpose is illegal in some way or another. Usually it's cybercrime related. When we talk about the dark web as a whole, too, it's also important to point out who is using the dark web, where the most active users of the dark web tend to reside. If we look at this breakdown, this came from a company called Chainalysis. We are going to be looking at the average number of users of the Tor network per country per day. And you can see the United States makes up almost a quarter of those users. There are several reasons why this might be happening. One of them, obviously, we talked about already, is the increase in criminal activity that we've seen with the dark web. But there are also some other reasons why normal, everyday people may want to utilize this kind of technology. It's not just for criminals. I will cover that here in just a second. But there are a lot of reasons why you may want to utilize some of the privacy features that are available through this type of network. Now, before we really get started, we need to answer one simple question, and that is, what is the dark web? There is a misconception, kind of a mystical quality about the dark web, where people think it is this clandestine kind of dark corner of the internet where only hackers like to hang out. That's not necessarily the case. Really what the dark web is an overlay network. It is built on top of the standard internet that you use every day. It just functions a little bit differently to enable a much greater element of privacy and a lot less ability to track your activity while using the network. It does require custom software to access. We'll talk about that as we move along here. The big point of the dark web, though, is anonymity. When we talk about going back and forth between websites, with the dark web, in theory, you shouldn't be able to connect the source and the destination of web traffic, just based on how that traffic is routed through. There's also a couple of other terms that we'll want to talk about here that you'll hear me use throughout the presentation. One of them is going to be clear web, the other one's going to be deep web. So let's talk about what those mean here for just a quick second. The clear web is basically defined as any normal websites that can be indexed by a search engine. These are going to be the things that you can visit on a daily basis. These are going to be e-commerce websites, they're going to be news websites, they're going to be basically anything that you can type into Google and pull back. That only makes up about 5% of the overall internet. The other 95% is split between what's referred to as the deep web, and these are things like cloud storage systems, these are medical record systems, email systems, things that you can't just directly access without something like a username or a password. That makes up about 90% of the internet. And then the last 5% is going to be the dark web. And this is really where the Tor network tends to come into play. Again, we'll cover that here in just a second. This is not indexable by normal search engines. It is not something where you can utilize Google to find things on the dark web. In fact, there is very little in terms of search engine functionality when we talk about darknet websites. And we'll get into that here as we go. Now, we do have to point out that criminals do utilize the dark web for a number of tasks. One of the big ones that we've probably seen in the news very much recently anyway is cyber extortion or ransomware. Ransomware groups tend to use the dark web to host things like their name and shame portals. They will transfer stolen information, they will sell stolen information, and they will utilize the dark web to mask their identity and their location while they're performing these illegal activities. We also see a big amount of illegal e-commerce. We see things like fake IDs, stolen credit cards, stolen personal information, hacker tools, drugs, guns, anything that you can probably think of. In fact, the worst things you can probably think of are likely going to be available for sale somewhere on the darknet. It has kind of become a home for that kind of activity. It's also used for coordinating activities between criminal groups and a lot more. Now, one of the big questions that we saw when we did our initial run through for this webinar is accessing the dark web actually legal? And the answer to that can be a little bit complicated. So we'll state it this way. Now, keep in mind, I am not a lawyer, but based on the information that we've pulled back, in many places around the world, accessing the dark web, at least the underlying network that powers it, is completely legal. However, the content you access, just like with the regular internet, may not be. So if you are planning on taking a trip down into the depths of the dark web, just be very, very cautious about how you're going about doing that. We don't click on random links. We're very careful about the things that we look at here. But the dark web does have some legitimate uses. It's not just for criminal activity. And as we saw, about half of the activity on the dark web is not considered to be criminal. The dark web can be used for things like avoiding censorship. If you are in a country where the news media is very heavily controlled or the flow of information is very heavily controlled, you can utilize the dark web to kind of circumvent some of those controls. You can collaborate with journalists anonymously. The publication ProPublica actually relies heavily on darknet submissions. People being able to submit whistleblower documents and other things like that without there being a traceable path back to them. That can be very important in some situations. We can also do things like view blocked news sources. We'll show you an example of that here in just a second. Access research, avoid being tracked by advertisers, which is always attractive to most people. Access social media, and a lot more. Now, when we talk about legitimate uses of the dark web, we can also talk about legitimate dark web sites. And I pulled up a couple here just to showcase the kind of organizations who have darknet websites, one of them being the New York Times itself. They are one of many news organizations who maintain a darknet presence. We also see social media outlets like Facebook and previously Twitter and Instagram using the darknet as a potential means to access their services. This really was highlighted beginning of last year when the Russian government and the Ukrainian government really started to kind of go head-to-head on things. Russia cracked down on the dissent that was being put publicly out on the internet about their activities by blocking things like social media. One of the ways that we were able to learn about that actual conflict and what was really happening in the background was through the use of things like the darknet's version of Facebook. People were able to actually post the stories, post the information that they were gathering without being blocked by internet censorship, which again can be very important. Now, we're going to go through a little bit of technical detail on the dark web here. Stick with me. I know this will get a little bit dry, but we'll get to the good stuff here in just a second. When we're talking about normal web surfing, realistically what we're talking about is using the clear web for your normal everyday activities. If I go to google.com, then google.com can see me and I can see Google. Very, very simple set of transactions there. We can see our pass through the network. We can see the data that's being passed back and forth. Everything is fairly normal. This also means, however, that other people can see some of that traffic as well, including things like your internet service provider, advertising trackers, and a lot more. The dark web, on the other hand, uses a series of nodes to transfer information from the source to the destination. And what makes this important is that those nodes cannot tell exactly where that data is coming from, or at least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. We'll talk about how that can be broken here a little bit later in the presentation. But what this means is that that traffic, for the most part, cannot be tracked. That's the big part about this. The network is built on anonymity. Now, I want to be clear about one thing here. The pathway through the network is encrypted, is anonymous in the network, but the data that is being sent is not. There have been multiple instances. WikiLeaks, as an example, was founded because Julian Assange was operating what's referred to as a Tor exit node and was able to hijack unencrypted information, top secret information, to start disseminating out to the rest of the world. The way that this functions is referred to as onion routing, and as they say in the movie Shrek, like ogres, onions have layers. That is exactly how the traffic in the dark web or the Tor network actually functions too. The message that you're sending is encrypted in layers, and the layers determine your pathway through the network. At each stage of that run through the network, a layer of that encryption will be peeled off, and that'll tell the data where it needs to go next. Visiting the dark web, too, requires some special software. You can't just get to it with a regular web browser. You need a web browser that's designed to work with that kind of an environment. Now, if you've watched any specials on cybercrime or on the dark web or anything like that, you've likely heard a very sensationalized kind of description of what this software looks like. I've watched a couple where they refer to it as custom hacking software or spy software or something like that. It's really not that bad. You can go to the torproject.org and download what's referred to as the Tor browser or the Onion Router browser. This is a custom version of Firefox that is built to work with that network, and that's really the only tool that you need to access this kind of information on the internet. Now, we get questions pretty frequently about how this traffic actually functions, and the way that we build our pathway through the network is referred to as a circuit. The circuit in general is going to go like this. We have our predetermined path that we're going to take to get from our source to our destination, and we're going to enter into the Tor network through what's called a guard node. This is a specifically authorized computer that acts as the entrance into the cluster of computers that are acting as our pathways here. From there, we jump into a series of middle nodes, and that's where our path is obscured from anyone who is trying to track our activity. And then we hit our exit node. That's the last step before we actually reach the server on the other end. TLS is used to establish these sessions, and that is how we establish our anonymous traffic. The reason this functions correctly is because of public key encryption. And public key encryption is hugely important for cybersecurity in general, but it's also very, very important for this kind of anonymous transmission. We'll show you how that works here after just a second. Realistically, what that means is we have a pair of encryption keys, a public key and a private key. The public key can be shared with anyone out there and can be used to decrypt anything that has been encrypted with that private key. Without this technology, the dark web would not be possible. Ransomware, coincidentally, would also really not be possible, but we won't get into that in this webinar too much. All right, so here's basically what that looks like, and this is going to be kind of a simplified example of how we traverse through the network. We have our data, and we have a series of wrapped layers around that data. We have our source. We know that we are going into node A to start with, and node A is going to see node B. Node B can then see node C. Node C can't see A, node A can't see C. So we're obscuring our traffic here in the middle. And at each one of these layers, a public key is going to be used to strip that layer of encryption off so that we can move to our next jump. When we finally hit that last jump on the network, that's our exit node, and we are out to our destination website. Now again, that jump between the exit node and the destination is where things get a little dicey for some people. That's where data stops being protected by the network, and that's where a lot of times we see personal information get exposed, secret documents get exposed, or something else that's going to break the anonymity here. All right, so with the Tor network, all we really have to do to get ourselves online is download the Tor browser. There are a couple others out there that you can do this with. Click on Connect to the Tor network, and we are off to the races. Now what? And this is the big question that we also get from a lot of people. Since you can't use something like Google on the dark web, since these sites are not necessarily publicized in any meaningful way, how do we actually figure out where to go? Well, there is a big group of enthusiasts on the regular internet, on the clear web, who track where darknet websites go. And in this case, we used a service called Tor.taxi. This was advertised as our ride to the darknet. We've also used Reddit or a couple other forums for this in the past. But this gives us those kind of initial jumping off points that allow us to kind of get a foothold in the door, get our bearings on the dark web and figure out where we're going. They also nicely color code things for us. So links in red are experiencing prolonged downtime. websites on the Darknet go down very, very frequently. It's just kind of the nature of the business. Links in orange are experiencing denial of service attacks. That happens also very frequently. And then they also give notifications when a Darknet market is going through what's called an exit scam. I'll cover what that is here in just a second. Now, our first stop on our trip to the dark web this time around was a place called Dread. And Dread is a forum that operates on the dark web, and it basically acts as a kind of a centralized information gathering point for other people who want to use this kind of a system. Think like Reddit, but a little bit darker. This is built specifically for the dark web itself. And when you look at some of the posts on this Dread front page, you can kind of get an idea for what we're looking at. We see an advertisement for the Bohemia Darknet Marketplace. We see people asking how to stay hidden. We see people asking if another marketplace is actually going to be reputable, if they can do business with it, and a lot more. They also give us links to things like Darknet markets. Now, when we're talking about Darknet markets, there's a couple things that we really do need to talk about here. One of the ones that we have used previously in a lot of our presentations has been a marketplace called Vice City. And Vice City was a place where we went actually to view and attempt to buy hacking software. Now, this was a nice find for us because it really did make it easy for us to find what we were looking for, to deal with Darknet vendors, and to figure out exactly where we needed to go to find something like a botnet or another significant piece of malware. But there have been some issues with this as we have moved down the road. So we have a quick example of that here, and let me give you a quick tour of it. This is the Vice City marketplace, and we can see some of the elements that they do have for sale here. We can see ransomware. We can see a ransomware pack with source code. Instant delivery goes for about $15. If you've seen our How Organizations Get Hacked presentation, we've gone through this whole transactional kind of interaction. We can see keyloggers for sale. We can become part of a botnet, and there's a lot more. Now, as we were doing the research for this, we started looking on that Dread marketplace and got a notification that the Vice City market should not be used anymore at this time. They were going through what is referred to as an exit scam. And an exit scam is not unique to the dark web. It actually happens in mainstream businesses as well. But when we look at it on the Darknet, it really turns into more of a criminals ripping off criminals situation, which, I mean, let's be honest about that. We can all sit back and kind of grin when we see something like that happen. Now, I feel like we should define what an exit scam is, so I'll go through this very quickly here. An exit scam is realistically when the operators of a market decide to rip off everyone else who's using that market. The market operators themselves will oftentimes go silent and stop completing the transactions that are being put through. Sometimes they'll even take their markets offline. Usually they say it's for extended maintenance or something clever like that to try to keep people off the trail for at least a few days. And then what they'll do is they'll rob what are referred to as escrow wallets. Now, transactions on the Darknet primarily take place using cryptocurrency, things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Monero and other things like that. We'll cover that list here a little bit later on down the road. But to guarantee that buyers are getting their funds and that buyers are getting their products and sellers are getting their funds, they will operate through a central wallet that the market controls, known as the escrow wallet. When an exit scam takes place, the operators will take every bit of Bitcoin or Monero or whatever else is in that wallet and just disappear. Because cryptocurrency is not necessarily traceable, it becomes very difficult to find where those funds actually went. And then the operators will just disappear off into the sunset with all of those funds. We saw this happen with Alpha Bay. We've seen this happen with Vice City, apparently, and we've seen this just as kind of a repeated thing. So when we're talking about Darknet marketplaces, yes, they are places where criminals can go to buy and sell their stolen goods, but they are not necessarily the most trustworthy places on the internet, which should be fairly obvious. Okay, so that being said, let's take a look at what these marketplaces actually look like. Let's go visit a Darknet marketplace. The one that we're going to show you right now is called the Abacus Marketplace. This has been in business on the Darknet since the year 2021, and they specialize in selling an entire array of illicit and illegal goods, primarily things like drugs, guns, and stolen information. We're going to shy away from going into the drugs and guns a little bit, not really the point of this presentation. We're more interested in things like stolen personal information, stolen passwords, and things like that. So let's take a look at what we have available here. One of the very first advertisements that we saw was from a seller who is advertising full U.S. information dumps on U.S. citizens. They go for about $50 a piece, and you can see the type of information that we're actually getting here. This is their date of birth, their address, their social security number, phone number, driver's license, credit score, credit report, background report. All of this stuff is used for identity theft. And then you can see right at the bottom, you get a real copy of a driver's license, ID scan, and photo, a selfie specifically, of the owner. These types of information pieces are used to bypass what are known as Know Your Customer regulations or KYC regulations. A lot of this has to do with cryptocurrency markets and bank accounts. This can also be used for identity verification for a bunch of other services that you sign up for on the internet. Now, one thing we did notice about this one was the seller themselves. The seller is whose name is DumpTrack. Had a bunch of customer reviews listed on their website. And we thought that was a little bit strange. I mean, there are customer reviews on a criminal's website. Well, as it turns out, yes. Not just on this one, though. We were actually able to track every market that this particular seller was involved in. And as it turns out, they've been involved in over 300 transactions on the dark web, 94.8% positive feedback. So we can take it kind of as gospel that DumpTrack is, in fact, selling legitimately stolen information out to a bunch of other criminals on the internet. If he's selling something that is not legitimate, that will get reflected in the feedback, and reputation tends to be very, very important for these darknet vendors. It's kind of an ironic thing when we talk about it that way. Other things that we found for sale on these darknet marketplaces were a little bit more onerous, things more targeted towards businesses in general. This is an example of one we found. This is an active business data dump. This includes their EIN number, the owner's full information, their credit information, and everything else you would need to impersonate this particular business. Normally this is done for the purpose of buying large amounts of illicit goods or goods, that you're then going to steal. We see scammers do this with fertilizer, with produce, with dairy, with a bunch of other things. Basically, they'll utilize the goodwill of that business to strike up multi-$1,000 transactions and then run off with the product to resell to someone else. Big scams happen this way, and it's not something that we really like to see out there, but unfortunately, it's there. We also see things like business bank accounts for sale. Bank accounts with routing numbers, ATM numbers, counterfeit checks, and a ton more. So realistically, again, what they're doing is impersonating a business. We also see things like verified cryptocurrency accounts, and these come through in ransomware cases very, very frequently. We'll talk about here a little bit later the OFAC checklist, or the Office of Foreign Asset Control. But when we're doing things like ransom negotiations, one of the big things that we have to do is verify who we're making a payment to. If that individual or that entity has been sanctioned by the government, we can't make that payment. So in a lot of cases, ransomware operators will buy these verified cryptocurrency accounts that are not sanctioned, and they'll use those to kind of ferry cryptocurrency back and forth between their accounts. Credit cards also hugely popular on the dark web. This should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone. Credit card data is one of the most commonly stolen pieces of data on the planet, and they are everywhere. We see things like 10 packs of credit cards going for about $70. We have an Amex Gold card with a guaranteed balance going for $65. We see Bank of America cards going for $40. I mean, these things are everywhere. And they oftentimes come with guarantees from the seller. If you buy a stolen credit card and that card doesn't work, you can go back to the seller and they'll either give you a new card or they'll refund your purchase. Forged electronic documents are also a big thing. We see here a couple of advertisements for basically the computer files to print off things like United States IDs and passports. This means that someone with the proper skill and the proper equipment could go into business falsifying IDs using these templates. And for the most part, these tend to be pretty accurate. We can also see things like credit card skimming machines and a lot more. Next, we see forged physical documents, and these things get really expensive when we actually look at it. You can see one of them on here is listed at $8,000, and it's a full identity pack for a U.S. citizen: ID, driver's license, and passport, all kind of ready to go. Oftentimes, these will also come with things like forged utility bills. They'll come with, again, selfies of the individual, so you can bypass verification regulations and a lot more. But yeah, $8,000 for this, and this is a physical good that has to actually be sent to you. A lot of stuff that's bought on the dark web, primarily when we're talking about things like guns and drugs, do actually just get sent through the mail when they're delivered to the person who actually bought them. Now, that's not to say that this is a foolproof situation. Yes, your transactions on the dark web may be anonymous, but sending something through the mail always comes with risk. This is from the Dread forums. This is something we see fairly frequently on the forums themselves. This is someone complaining that their shipments from the dark web never show up at their house. The seller is giving them tracking numbers. They're able to verify that the items actually did ship, but they never actually show up where they're supposed to. And then people come up with normal questions. Were the packages tracked? Did you use your real name and address when you bought this off the dark web? Did you have more than one package in the mail at a time? And a lot of times, if you don't receive it, again, you can go back to that marketplace and you can dispute this. All right, back into the cybercrime area of things. One of the other major elements that we see for sale on the dark web are usernames and passwords, credentials for a lot of services around. Here is another darknet seller who is selling 10,000, these are in packs of 10,000. 10,000 at a time, freshly spammed email addresses and passwords. You get 10,000 emails and passwords, and they promise they do not resell these credentials. They're doing this so they can guarantee that the credentials will actually work. Now, this happens very, very frequently, as I mentioned, up to the point where at this point, as of today, it's estimated that there's more than 24 billion usernames and passwords that are available on the dark web. We actually have a large database of those in our malware lab here at LMG. We do a lot of analytics on that to see what people are using as passwords, what we see as kind of the bad habits that people are getting into. It's telling when we look at things, especially when we look at things like password sentiment. How many people have profanity or derogatory things in their passwords? We'll cover that in a different webinar. But again, this is an increase of 65% in just 2 years. The number of usernames and passwords stolen has just skyrocketed at this point. Now, this begs a question, and again, this comes up fairly frequently. What if your information is found for sale on the dark web? This is a big concern for a lot of people, as well it should be. I mean, you don't want your information being bought and sold by a criminal. The first thing that we can tell you to do is don't panic. There are a lot of pieces of information on the dark web that are for sale. I know for a fact my information has been sold on the dark web quite a few times at this point. I've been involved in 16 different data breaches since the year 2015. But there are some steps you can take to lessen the impact of your information being stolen or being traded. The first thing you can do is change your passwords. If your username and password is stolen, change the password. That password now becomes basically unusable. And if you're concerned about keeping track of all your passwords in a safe and secure way, highly recommend using something like a password manager with multi-factor authentication. That's the next thing, enable multi-factor authentication, and this should go for any service that you can possibly think of. Most of us are used to using this in our corporate lives, but we highly recommend using this for personal services as well. If you have MFA available, absolutely turn it on. It is a great way to dramatically increase your security posture without too much work on your part. The other thing is to watch out for phishing, smishing, and vishing attempts. This is going to be phishing through email, smishing is SMS-based, and vishing is voice-based. If your information is out there, that allows criminals to craft some very targeted types of phishing scams right at you. They can be a lot more successful this way. Finally, monitor your credit report, and then if you are worried about bank accounts or your mobile devices or something like that, contact your institution and add an additional challenge, a passcode, a PIN, a need for in-person verification, or something like that, before any large-scale changes can be made to the account. That can stop a criminal from actually doing something that will empty your bank account or SIM-jack your phone, as an example. All right, so we'll wrap up here on the Darknet Marketplace stuff. The other things that we see are hacker services and malware, and these are big when it comes to the number of listings. This is actually how a lot of amateur hackers get into the market, and amateur hackers are a big problem around the world, mainly because they're just buying software off the shelf that they don't really know how to use, and they can wreak havoc on a network if something goes wrong with that software. First and foremost, though, we have these. These are flooding services. Now, flooding services are traditionally used when someone is trying to break into one of your accounts and you have multi-factor authentication, like text-based, enabled on that account. What they will do is they will try to hijack that SMS code, and then to keep you from realizing that code has been sent, they will flood your phone with messages. They'll flood your email with messages or something like that. If they drop 5,000 different messages into your email, that's going to do a pretty good job of obscuring the fact that that multi-factor code had already been sent to you. It's going to make it a lot more difficult to catch. We also see flat-out malware for sale. So in this case, this is, again, coming from that Abacus marketplace. We can see a Bitcoin stealer. This is a data scraper that can be installed on a computer, usually through something like a spam email, and it's going to go after your cryptocurrency wallets. The one below it is a little bit more terrifying. This is the Zeus botnet. And the Zeus botnet, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of like the granddaddy of all botnets on the internet. We've actually had copies of it in our malware lab. We played around with the software a little bit. It's available for pretty much anyone who wants to buy it, and it is very, very difficult to detect and stop. This is the software itself with a guide on how to steal bank account information directly from your computer. And if we looked at the feedback on this, I should have grabbed a screenshot of it, but there are a number of the buyers for this product who have espoused how accurate the information was and how good the software was when they actually picked it up. And it's $5. That is a very low barrier to entry for a cyber criminal, especially for a piece of malware that's this powerful. Something we need to watch out for. Now, darknet marketplaces are not the only place where you can buy malware on the internet. There are actually specialists who will custom build malware for you, for a price, of course. This is the Eternity Project, and the Eternity Project popped up last year. We've been following them for a little while. They are purely a malware as a service organization. Their entire business model, similar to something like Microsoft, is to build software and then license it out to people for use. Major difference being that these guys are building malware. They have things like information stealers, cryptocurrency miners. They have a clipper, which is a fairly devious piece of malware. It actually watches for when you're trying to copy and paste things like bank account information or cryptocurrency wallets. It'll cut out that address in the middle of your copy paste cycle and put their address in place. So you'll accidentally end up sending money to the wrong bank account, the wrong cryptocurrency wallet, and a lot more. The big one though is down in the bottom left, and that's going to be their ransomware offering. Ransomware, as we all know, is a bane of cybersecurity. It is very, very destructive when it hits. It is a massive financial hit to organizations when they are taken down by ransomware. There's operational disruptions. There are people getting fired, resigning because of ransomware attacks, and it's in the news constantly. For the low price of $470 a year, you can license your own custom ransomware from the Eternity Group, and they will give you an entire rundown on how to use it, how to maximize your ransomware impact. They can customize the backgrounds they put on your computer, your ransom amounts, your ransom notes. And if you've looked at the prices behind ransomware, I mean, we've regularly seen ransoms go into the millions of dollars for larger organizations who have been hit. You can get the idea that for $470 a year with potential in returns of millions of dollars, that's not a big barrier. We're going to see a lot of attackers going after something like this. It saves them a ton of work, and it just makes it easier for them to attack us, which is really unfortunate. Other things that we see out there are data dumps, and this usually comes after a ransomware attack takes place. This is a data dump from an organization right here in the United States. It is 376,000 lines. It includes things like driver's license numbers, social security numbers, plain text passwords. All of this was stolen from a database from a hacked company. They were hit with a ransomware attack. The ransomware operators either did not get paid the ransom they were asking for, or they did and just went ahead and released the data anyway. But these are then resold on multiple forums. And there are marketplaces that specifically deal in just stolen data. There was one that we were following called Marketo, which was built specifically for the purpose of conglomerating all of this stolen data and then reselling it out to the highest bidder. Kind of a hard way to go. The other thing that we see, and you've likely seen a variation of one of these before if you've been paying attention to cybersecurity news, are name and shame ransomware sites. The big one that we're watching right now is going to be the Clop ransomware gang. They are responsible for going after a piece of software called MoveIt, in which a bunch of big organizations around the world had very, very sensitive data stolen and then published on their Darknet portal. Now, the portals function to do a couple of different things. One, they act as a communication hub between the ransomware victim and the ransomware operator. If you go into something like Lockbit's website, you can engage in a chat with Lockbit operators directly. You can speak to them in real time. And that's how a lot of the negotiations that we do actually take place. Same thing with Medusa, same thing with Everest. They all kind of follow along about the same path here. These have really become popular since the Maze ransomware group started doing this back in about 2019. And back then it was kind of a novelty, but they proved that this was a very effective business model, and a lot of other ransomware groups have simply just followed suit. It's now become a pretty decent portion of Darknet traffic. The other thing that these tend to do is act as a leverage point for victims of ransomware. If you know for a fact that your name and the information that was stolen from you is going to be put out there in public for anyone to grab, anyone can see this, anyone can download it, everyone can see that your organization was hacked, this is going to cause some major issues for you, especially if you are an organization who really values the reputation that you've built with your client base. This also leads to a lot of downstream data breach notifications. So with a MoveIt data breach, for example, we've already started to see a lot of organizations, especially out of places like London and the European Union, start to announce data breaches. Now, none of these, or most of these organizations were not directly hit by the Clop ransomware gang, but they were doing business with someone like a payroll company who was. Their information was stolen as a part of that hack, and so they had to come out and declare a data breach. So we start seeing this cascading series of announcements of all of these organizations and letting everyone know that your data has potentially been stolen. And it kind of becomes chaotic at that point. It becomes very difficult for us to actually track when these things are, or where these things are originating. Now, the other thing we have here are hacker forums, and this is something we see in a lot of news articles. We're at LMG, we're a member of quite a few. I'll show you how we did that here in just a second. But hacker forums are kind of a meeting point for hackers around the planet. They can discuss tactics, they can sell their software, they can sell the data that they've stolen, and a lot more. This is the Crypt forums. This is one that is available on both the clear web and the dark web in different variations, and you can see some of the things they're selling. If we look in the upper corner here, we can see that they're selling SS7 gateway access. SS7, if you're not familiar with that term, is an acronym that means Signal System 7. Signal System 7 is a kind of underlying portion of the cellular infrastructure that's responsible for handling SMS messaging or text messaging. When we talk about things like text messaging, we have to remember that the original hardware and software that was built for text messaging was deployed back in the 1980s. It's about 40 years old at this point. It was never built for high security, and it has kind of suffered because of that. With access to something like an SS7 gateway, you could potentially intercept text traffic, including things like multi-factor authentication codes and a lot more. This usually goes towards account compromise and data theft, but there's a lot of other things that people could do with it. The other thing we see here is an advertisement for quick ransomware. And ransomware for sale on the dark web is not a surprise at all. However, this one we thought was unique. One of the big things that we wanted to point out about this was how this seller is advertising it. And they're saying that this is written in a programming language called Go, or Golang. What this means, if you're familiar with programming languages, is this is a type of ransomware that can fairly easily evade detection by antivirus software and EDR software. Antivirus software is notoriously bad at catching things that are written in non-standard programming languages, and a lot of hackers out there are moving to these types of languages to kind of increase the value of their product. And again, having a place to sell that is really beneficial for them. Now, gaining access to these forums is not the easiest thing in the world to do. There are a lot of hoops that you have to jump through in most of these cases because the owners of the forum, the operators of the forum, want to verify that you are not something like a law enforcement officer, because having an FBI agent in your malware forum could be pretty detrimental to the people that are actually using it. So they'll go through verification checks. This forum that you're seeing here is what's referred to as an initial access broker. And what they do is they sell access into other networks. If you want to buy remote access into something like a Fortune 500 company for the purpose of cybercrime, you can go to a seller like this and they will sell you that access. Now, if you want to apply as a seller on one of these systems, they ask that you provide 10 samples of logins so that they can test and make sure that your information is actually valid, that it's going to be worth something, and it's going to generate that kind of traffic to their website. If you want to apply as a buyer, you actually have to put some skin in the game on this one. They want a $500 deposit just to get access to the marketplace in the first place. This is non-refundable. This is not something that you can apply towards a future purchase. You're just buying access to the information. Again, this keeps people who are just curious about what's for sale there, or law enforcement who is looking at who is buying it, in a lot of cases from gaining access. It's a successful tactic. It doesn't stop everyone from getting in, but it does definitely lessen the number of potential, we'll call them looky-loos, that would make their way into that forum. One of the other big forums that we've seen out there is the XSS forums. And this is a Russian language forum where we see a lot of information come up for sale. A lot of malware announcements come up here. A lot of data breach announcements come up here. If you've ever read a cybersecurity article and they mention how they found a new strain of malware on a, quote, hacker forum, it was probably this forum. We have a membership to this forum, and I just wanted to go over and show you what we had to do to get there. So there were some difficulties for us getting into this information repository in the first place. First and foremost, there's a language barrier. I don't fluently speak Russian. I certainly don't fluently read Russian. So we had to translate a lot of that information in real time to make sure we could understand what it was we were actually getting into here. We also had to go through a verification and vetting process before they would even allow us to access the base levels of this forum. They want to make sure that we're not a cop. They want to make sure that we're actually serious about gaining access. And there's a couple ways you can do this. One, you can have a currently active member of the forum vouch for you. You can pay them a bunch of cryptocurrency to get in, or as we did, you can use a verification token from another hacker forum. We had been a member of the breach forums, and we had verification tokens from when we created our initial accounts there that the XSS forum was willing to accept. We used one of those, and they eventually let us in, but it took a little while for the admins to review it and to actually verify that we could gain access. And here's the message that we got back from them. went ahead and blurred out the name, just so we'll keep everything nice and safe. But this is the intro to the XSS forums. Now, these things can be translated into English using something like Google, which is what we normally use just to keep things moving quickly. But when you get into the forum itself, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Pretty much everything in there is in Russian, so it does take a little while to go through. But just with going through some of the initial offerings there, we found some great hacking tutorials. We found ways to obscure PowerShell scripts so that antivirus wouldn't catch them. We found people who are offering offshore hosting, so you could run your ransomware enterprise from somewhere that's outside of U.S. jurisdiction. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. We'll keep you updated. We're doing a research project on that forum specifically right now. We'll add it into our presentations as we move along, show you a little bit more about what we found there. All right, so now that we've talked about all of this information that's on the dark web, all these places you can go to buy it, everything else, that leads to a question that, again, we get fairly frequently. And this is something that you've probably seen advertised on TV or on the internet recently. And that's the concept of a dark web data scan. Can you scan the dark web? Can you find out if your information has been stolen and is being traded back and forth by hackers on the dark web? And the short answer here, unfortunately, is kind of not really. There are some methods you can use to look at publicly available or released data breaches and see if your information is in those data breaches. We do that here. We do it for our clients. We do it for a lot of people. But that's not necessarily a good representation of whether or not your data is actively being trafficked on the dark web. Many of the sales of stolen data on the dark web, especially newly stolen data, take place in access-controlled forums. They are not publicized. It's not something that you can just run a scan for keywords across the internet and find. Does not work that way. Encryption is used very heavily. It is difficult to get access to these things, and oftentimes they are simply traded back and forth between two individuals on a third-party hosted site, something like mega.nz or something like that. Again, not something that we can actually scan. The other problem here is that if your data is identified in one of these repositories in the dark web, it can be almost impossible to pinpoint where that data came from. Depending on how many data breaches that has been involved in, how many hands it's gone through, we may not know when that data was stolen, we don't know who it was stolen from, and we don't even know if that data is really accurate anymore. In fact, in a lot of cases, insurance companies will deny coverage for something like a dark web scan, simply because of how inconsistent they can be. Now, that all being said, I will point out that using a dark web scanning service can be a valuable tool. You can take a look and see if your data pops up in a currently available public data breach. You can verify that you're not using any passwords that have already been compromised, but I would not take it as gospel that your information has not been stolen, period. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about some good news coming out of the dark web. And primarily when we talk about good news on the dark web, we're talking about things like law enforcement takedowns. Now, we've seen criminals kind of acting with impunity, with trading stolen information back and forth, selling guns, selling drugs, selling software, and we get asked fairly frequently, well, what happens here? Does law enforcement ever take these guys down? And the answer is yes. It's not a speedy process, but it does happen. We just over the last year have seen a couple of different major darknet marketplaces taken offline. The one you see on the screen in front of you is the Genesis marketplace. This was responsible for the sale of over 80 million pairs of usernames and passwords of credentials on the internet. International law enforcement was able to take them down. They were able to arrest about 100 members of this forum, 100 of the operators and vendors behind it, in about 200 raids. But it took a massive intercontinental effort to make this happen. It's not the easiest thing in the world for law enforcement to do. Another one that we saw get taken down very recently was the monopoly market. And this was actually taken down mainly because of a new agency that's operating through the U.S. government. We'll cover who they are here in just a second. But we also noticed that there was a significant intervention from foreign law enforcement here. In fact, the monopoly marketplace was actually operated for almost 2 years with German authorities acting in partial control of their infrastructure. They were watching these transactions taking place, building up their cases against the individual sellers, tracking them down, finding out who they were, where they were, how much they were making, until finally, in May of this year, they were able to spring. They were part of an operation called Spector, and they were able to arrest 288 vendors of that market, bring back about $56 million in cryptocurrency. So that was a substantial law enforcement bust, something that we always love to see. One of the other changes that we've seen over the last couple of years, too, is the move to mobile for things like Darknet marketplaces. There was an organization called Encryption who is making a custom Android version with a phone that was supposed to be a highly secured and kind of ready-to-go phone used for criminal activity. They promised things like unbreakable encryption. They promised that you could not be tracked. They promised anonymity in all of your transactions, and it was not cheap. It was $1,000 just to buy the phone, and it was over $1,600 every 6 months to license the use of the service. Unfortunately for them, probably fortunately for the rest of us, it was not any of what they claimed it was going to be. It was not unbreakable encryption. It was not anonymous. And law enforcement was able to track down and arrest almost 6,500 worldwide individuals over the course of a couple of years using this service. They seized things like properties, like boats, like cryptocurrency, planes, and a lot more. And you can see in the breakdown from Europol what the exact activities that these users were doing kind of looked like. About 35% was straight up organized crime, 33% was drug trafficking, and then we see things like murder for hire, firearms, and money laundering as other elements of this. So yeah, not a great place to be. Probably a good thing they got taken offline. And yeah, almost $1 billion seized in value in cryptocurrency across. Now, I mentioned we would talk about law enforcement as a whole here. And that's what we'll do now. So starting in 2018, the U.S. federal government put together an initiative called JCODE. This is the Joint Criminal Opioid and Darknet Enforcement Team. And it's a cooperative effort between a bunch of different agencies inside the United States and international law enforcement agencies as well. We see the FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Post Office Inspection Service, HSI, and others all coming together to share information and to facilitate these large-scale takedowns of things like Darknet marketplaces. The big thing they were focusing on were the vendors behind them, and they started going out with a couple of large-scale operations. First one was called Disruptor, and you can see some of the countries that were involved in this. We can see Germany on there, we can see the Ukraine on there, we can see Britain, Canada, a lot more. We can also see Operation Spectre, and Operation Spectre was one of the more recent ones. We mentioned it with one of the Darknet market busts, and was responsible for the stoppage of a major section of criminal enterprise. Now, obviously, this isn't going to stop it permanently. Darknet marketplaces kind of tend to be like a hydra. If you cut off one head, two more come back to take its place. But it's a good path to follow. It's something that we don't want to discount as being useless or anything like that. Great job, guys. We also started to see ransomware operators being publicly named online, and this is something that we see when the anonymity of the dark web is broken down. It's not something that as I mentioned before, the dark web is not something we consider to be a perfectly anonymous type of system to use. There are ways that anonymity can be broken. Usually it's user error. I'll talk about that in a second. But it's good for us because we can start to see the faces behind some of these massive criminal enterprises. In this case, this is Mikhail Matveev. He is the Russian hacker who was I believe it was a Lockbit operator. No, I'm sorry, Babic ransomware operator, charged in the attacks against the DC National Police. From just a couple of years ago. If you don't remember that one, the Washington, D.C. Police Department suffered a ransomware attack, and a bunch of confidential information was stolen, including things like the names of confidential informants. That was a potentially disastrous data leak, and this was the individual behind it. He's been identified. We have pictures of him, and the FBI has actually put out active rewards for his apprehension. We can see another one here. This is a Russian national who was arrested in Arizona, of all places. He acted as a ransomware operator for the Lockbit, Babic, and Hive ransomware groups, and law enforcement was actually able to track him down because of cryptocurrency transfers to wallets that were linked to his name. You remember earlier when I talked about the fully vetted cryptocurrency wallets for sale on the dark web? Those are for sale to avoid something like this from happening. The reason that he was actually identified was because he had to go through that know your customer process. He had to verify his account to actually be able to send and receive things like Bitcoin, and because of that. And because of blockchain forensics, law enforcement was finally able to track him down. Now, a quick word on cryptocurrency payments for those of you who are curious about how cryptocurrency works on the dark web, especially in regards to ransomware payments. There's a couple things we want to be very clear about. Cryptocurrency payments are not the safest thing to partake in, especially if you're dealing with a ransomware group. There is the chance that they're just going to run off with your payment. These are non-reversible transactions, so you would never get anything back in the first place. But we also have to be careful about who we issue these cryptocurrency payments to. I mentioned earlier the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC. The Office of Foreign Asset Control offers a list of sanctioned individuals, people that are considered, persona non grata to the United States. They are entities and individuals that you are not allowed to do business with in any way, shape, or form, including things like ransom payments. So if you are the victim of a ransomware attack and your ransomware operator is on that OFAC list, we cannot pay a ransom to that operator. We have to check that. The nice part here, though, is there are many different avenues and many different partners that you can engage with if you do, unfortunately, suffer that kind of an attack that can keep something like this from happening. Your insurance provider can be a huge benefit here. They can get you in with a skilled ransom negotiator and a payment or a settlement processor who can do those checks for you and make sure you don't run afoul of the law, because that's the last thing you would need in a situation like that. One of the questions that we got when we were putting this webinar together is which cryptocurrencies are common on the dark web. And I know I'm leaning a little hard into cryptocurrency here, this is not a webinar on cryptocurrency, but we can't really talk about the dark web without talking about the anonymous payment that goes on with it. And in this case, the top two that we see are going to be Bitcoin and Monero. Bitcoin, most people know what Bitcoin is at this point. That should come as no surprise to anyone. Monero is what's referred to as a privacy coin, meaning that the blockchain or the ledger of transactions that it operates on is highly obfuscated. Very, very difficult to trace payments from one end to the other. And criminals actually prefer to use this type of cryptocurrency to mask their activities. We've seen a lot of ransomware operators also start to demand Monero as their preferred payment of choice. Insurance companies, on the other hand, will often specify that you have to pay in Bitcoin. And that's because with the Bitcoin blockchain, you can track those payments to a certain extent. Now, the wallets themselves may be anonymous, but we can track the flow of funds back and forth until they hit something that we can actually identify. And there are some great news stories from a few years ago about the recovery of cryptocurrency from both cryptocurrency theft and ransomware payments that are kind of heartwarming to see. Now, when we talk about blockchain forensics, there are multiple organizations that specialize in the blockchain, basically. Chainalysis is one that we rely on heavily for a lot of the information that we pull back on here. Great organization to work with, and they're very, very talented at tracing this information through what would otherwise be a very difficult network to track. When we're tracking things on the blockchain, there's a few different ways we can trace the flow. We can do network analysis, actually see where things go in and out of the network, which wallets they're being transferred to, and so on. We can look at transaction clustering. We can look at those know your customer regulations to see who owns certain wallets along the chain. And then artificial intelligence and machine learning have gone a long way towards making this a much easier process to work through. And remember, if you're dealing with criminals online, they're probably going to ask you for Monero. You probably noticed in some of those Darknet marketplace shots, they had a Monero button. There's a reason for that. Mentioned earlier, too, anonymity on the dark web. It is an imperfect solution when we talk about fully anonymous internet traffic, and there are some specific ways in which that anonymity can be broken. One of them, obviously, is going to be malware. If you have malware on your computer, even if you're using something like the dark web, you're likely going to have information stolen that's going to identify who you are, and hackers can use that to target you with things like phishing attacks. There are also software exploits. We see these pop up with the Tor network as a whole every once in a while. We saw a couple of specials at Black Hat a couple of years ago about what are called timing attacks, where they can look at the source, they can look at the data flow through the dark web and figure out how long it took to make that traversal, figure out the start and end point from there. It's not an exact science, but it was fairly accurate. One of the big things that we see, though, is also hardware fingerprinting. Most people don't realize that things like your graphics drivers, your processor, the size of your monitor, the specific drivers you have installed, we can put those together and actually make a pretty accurate fingerprint of your computer specifically. And then if law enforcement ever confiscates that computer, they can use that fingerprint to match up with your activity on the dark web. Your path through the network doesn't really matter at that point if they can get a hold of that information. And then, of course, the big one here is user error. If you accidentally use your real name, use a verified cryptocurrency account, use traceable email, log into social media, something like that, that can very, very quickly break the anonymity of your time on the dark web. Okay, so to wrap up here, what can we learn from the dark web? Why did we go through all this? Well, there are a couple things that we can do as general internet users to make sure that we are not going to fall victim to a data theft that shows up on the dark web. And if our data does show up in the dark web, we know kind of how to respond to minimize the impact of that. First, obviously, use a strong and unique password for absolutely everything, and use a password manager with multi-factor authentication. If If you want more information on password managers, please feel free to message me. I can give you all the information you'd like on that. Make sure you're using phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. Stay away from things like text message or email-based multi-factor authentication. And then watch out for those phishing attempts, primarily those spear phishing attempts, the ones that have a lot of personal data in them. Don't click suspicious links, obviously. Don't install random applications from unknown sources. And proactively check if your information is popping up on the dark web. There are free dark web scanning services out there. There are paid dark web scanning services. We talked about the potential effectiveness of those, but they can be somewhat useful. And then proactively check things like Have I Been Pwned? If you've never been to Have I Been Pwned, I highly recommend you check it out. Go in, drop your email into their system, and it'll tell you which data breaches you've potentially been involved in. Nice service to have at your fingertips. Okay, so I will wrap up at this point. If there are any questions, again, my name is Matt Duran with LMG Security. Thank you so much for joining me. And Tamara, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt. We did have a few questions that came from our audience during the presentation. The first question was approximately how many middle nodes usually exist between exit and entrance nodes?
Okay, so the pathway through the Tor network can vary depending on your configuration and what the network is kind of set up to do at that point. Traditionally, we anticipate to see 3 nodes in between the guard node and the exit node, and that is enough of a stretch that we can obscure the start point and the end point of traffic. Now, that can be bigger, but it doesn't usually drop below 3.
Great, thank you. Second question was, what should I do if I think my data has been stolen?
If you think your data has been stolen. So there's a couple things that you can do. One of them is going to be to proactively check a service like Have I Been Pwned, or utilize one of the free services. Again, if you think your data was recently stolen, those aren't going to be super effective. But if it was stolen a while ago, they may give you an indication as to when it was stolen and who it was stolen from. If that's not the case, if you think your data was just recently stolen, say that you were a member of one of the companies that was hit by MoveIt, and you're concerned about your data winding up on the dark web, there's a couple things that you can do. One of them is going to be to change your passwords. Obviously, that is a very low-hanging fruit kind of activity that can nullify the effectiveness of stolen data right away. Other things, though, are a little bit more involved. We recommend setting up things like additional verifications with your bank accounts, PIN codes with your cell phone or mobile providers to make sure that somebody can't SIM jack your phone, and then basically the need for in-person verification for any large financial transactions involving your accounts. Those are things that can be set up pretty easily with your financial institutions and other providers, but it does take a little bit of time to get those things into effect.
Thanks, Matt. That's very helpful. The next question was, is it illegal to buy products off the dark web?
Is it illegal to buy products off the dark web? Okay, so the answer is largely going to depend on what it is you're buying from the dark web. There are vendors who have legitimate products for sale on the dark web that you can absolutely go buy with cryptocurrency, have sent to your house directly, and not have to worry about it at all. That being said, there are a lot of counterfeit vendors who sell things like counterfeit musical instruments, as an example, who it may look like it's a legitimate purchase, but it may run afoul of customs laws or something like that. So just be very careful about who you're buying things from, making sure that they are a verified, reputable seller, and that you're buying authentic purchases. Obviously, buying drugs off the internet is going to be illegal. Same thing with buying some firearms. It's that shouldn't come as a surprise to everyone. But yes, you can buy things off the dark web in a legal fashion.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what industries are most targeted by ransomware attacks?
Industries that are most targeted by ransomware attacks kind of depends on which country that we're referring to. Inside the United States, the big ones that we see are going to be healthcare, education, municipal government, and financial services. Those tend to they all tend to occupy about the same percentage. We also see managed service providers up there very, very heavily. But when you think about it, it's organizations that rely heavily on public-facing technology, who oftentimes have proprietary public-facing technology. So financial institutions and hospitals are great examples of that. Oftentimes they'll have custom-designed software for their organizations that they are expected to use for a decade or more. And eventually someone's going to find a way to break into that software, and software exploitation is a major way that ransomware operators break in. So yeah, that's about where I'd go with that one.
Got it, thank you. And our last question for today is, why is it so difficult to shut a dark web market down?
Yeah, we get that one a lot. So the big problem that we run into with the question of why does it take law enforcement so long to shut these marketplaces down has to do with a couple of things. One, the anonymity of the dark web makes it hard to figure out where these marketplaces are even being hosted in the first place. Once that gets figured out, it becomes pretty easy to take their infrastructure down. But then we have to deal with the subject of who is actually running the marketplace. And depending on whether or not we can even identify who that is, and then more importantly, where in the world they reside, it can become a big international effort to get a hold of those people. If the dark web operators are operating out of somewhere like Russia or Estonia or somewhere like that, it can be really difficult to get cooperation between those governments and the FBI, at least up to the point where they're able to go in and arrest the people behind the marketplaces. So a lot of political back and forth goes on here, and it unfortunately just takes time.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. Once again, this is Tamara with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me at info@lmgsecurity.com, find me on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.